Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Pizza Press and Politics. Today we have Jennifer Smith, the editor of the Dorchester Reporter, which is our local newspaper here, covering the neighborhood of Dorchester. And as we normally do, we're going to make a couple quick announcements, and then we'll go around the room with an icebreaker question. By the way, you don't have to sit on the radiators. We have chairs up here, down here, if you want to grab a chair. The announcements are next week. For Pizza Press and Politics, we have kind of a more political cast. We have a woman named Martha Durkee. Oh, goodness, I just forgot her last name. Martha, say it again? Neumann. Thank you very much. Martha Durkee Neumann from Mass Alliance. She is a campaign fundraiser for them. So it's sort of a different kind of, sort of looking at the other side of what's going out there, sort of the political side of the equation. And the next thing we do is our icebreaker question. And the icebreaker question today, since we have a person from a news organization, is what is your favorite news organization to read? And so when you answer, please give your name and your major. I'm Matt Carroll. I'm a professor here, and it's a tie for me. I think it's between the Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. So now I'm going to turn to Jennifer, and go ahead.
All right, so as you mentioned, I'm Jennifer Smith. I graduated from Northeastern in 2015, so I'm back. I did not get lost in this building. I'm very proud of myself, and my favorite news organization is going to read and check in on regularly is probably going to sound a little bit funny, but it's actually the Park Record in Park City, which is where I went to high school in Utah, just because their police blotter alone is a thing of beauty, because it's just people getting drunk and trying to ride model moose. And it's a nice change from the normal news diet.
Go ahead, Dan.
I'm Dan Kennedy. I graduated from Northeastern in 1979.
As did I, by the way, so yeah.
My favorite news organization is the New York Times, although I have to say I love the Times and I love to hate the Times.
All right.
Alexi Bayak, were we saying where we graduated from?
Well, you might as well throw it in, what the heck, yeah.
Amherst College, 2006, and my favorite would have to probably be, New York Times is every day on my doorstep, so.
Physically? You get a physical paper?
Yeah.
Ah, interesting, okay.
I'll talk to you about the professor discount.
Okay. Jennifer.
All right, so hi everyone, good morning, afternoon, what time is it? So I am the news editor for the Dorchester Reporter, so that's a family-founded publication that was started in 1983 that covers Dorchester, and the basic Dorchester spiel is it's the city's largest neighborhood, actually. So if you took just the population of Dorchester out of the city of Boston in general, it would be the fourth largest city in the entire state. So it's a community newspaper that basically covers a tiny city within another city. And I've been there for 3 years now. It's kind of got a reputation as a talent churning factory where my predecessor, Lauren Dezensky, actually went over to Politico, and she's just going over to CNN now. So I hope she moved safely. And we kind of cover everything. If you think about Dorchester as the place where some of the more fun politicians are hanging out, for instance, the mayor lives in Dorchester. Ayanna Pressley, the city councilor who just won the Democratic nomination to go replace Michael Capuano in Congress, she's a Dorchester resident. And it's basically a very diverse neighborhood, lots of different communities of color. It's got a pretty interesting history as far as being founded on the same day as Boston, but while Boston was having some issues actually sustaining itself, Dorchester had pairs, so we were good. And so what I took to kind of get to the Reporter was sort of an interesting tack. I went to Northeastern, and then I was a co-op at the Boston Globe on the night desk for the Metro section, so I guess you could classify that at the time as more of the murder and mayhem beat. It wasn't so much going out and doing features. It was very much nothing good happens in the city after 5 p.m., and I worked from 5 p.m. to 1:30 in the morning. So I went from there, I did that for 6 months, and I kept working as a weekend reporter there, which is a great opportunity if any of you have a chance to do it, because you can stay in school but also kind of keep a foot in the ground of the working world in journalism. And then when I was in my senior year and I was taking a constitutional law course, I actually also was brought in by a colleague at the Globe to freelance for the German press agency, which is a wire service, to cover the Tsarnaev trial. So I was covering that. I was doing the Globe on weekends, and I was also in my final year here. And I graduated, I moved to South Boston, was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, and Lauren, who I knew from the Globe, said, hey, you may not necessarily know about this newspaper. It's small, it's a good community thing, but frankly, we have some of the best political local development coverage in the city. And you can tell that because other publications will take it from us. And so I came in, I interviewed there, and I started in 2015. Staffer for 2 years, really got to know the neighborhood, and I became the news editor about a year ago. So it's a small staff, but one thing that's really been apparent in recent years is just the value of all of the parts of a news ecosystem. So what you hear a lot, as all of you mentioned, is people are very used to kind of reading their favorite national publication, their city publication, and for a lot of people, the Globe is about as local as it gets. So if you're trying to figure out what's happening in your neighborhood, you kind of have to rely on the bigger news organizations to want to cover it in the first place, and they have the same staffing restrictions that everyone else does. So what the Dorchester Reporter tends to cover might be along the same lines. It might be politics, it might be development, and we'll probably get there a lot of the time before the bigger publications do, because we're the ones at the civic meetings. We're the ones that neighbors will call and text and tweet at odd hours of the night because they see a building going up on their block and they have feelings about it, and they want you to know about that. So I guess when you're thinking about the news that you're consuming, and we all know as journalism students, of course, that the sources that you're pulling from are really important, it makes a big difference for local communities to know the journalists that are covering them. They see me all the time. They see our reporters all the time. They see our interns all the time. And there's a big difference when you're covering a story, for instance, like the Massachusetts 7th congressional race with Ayanna Pressley and Michael Capuano, when you're someone that has been covering them for 3 years. So we actually had the first interview with Ayanna Pressley after she won. And as a small organization, you're always kind of looking for ways to expand your reach. It's the Reporter has sort of an interesting place in the ecosystem where people in Dorchester know who we are, and people in journalism know who we are. The other organizations know who we are, but the average person in the city probably doesn't. And so there's this awareness now as we have a partnership with WBUR, the NPR station, where every once in a while someone might hear a Dorchester reporter voice on the airwaves that they might not have expected. And it's because good journalism happens at all levels of the city. And a really major thing to bear in mind is we can kind of act as the feeder for a lot of bigger organizations. So if you're trying to figure out, for instance, if you're a co-op at the Globe, if you're working for the Herald, if you're working as a stringer for the Associated Press, a really good habit to get into is to find out what your local paper is, find out what your local news organizations are, even if they're just smaller radio stations, because they do good work, and it might be a bit of a hunt sometimes. But if they advance something on the local level that can be blown out onto the city level, that can sometimes be the root of a really good story. And I think the last thing I'll do before I open it up to any specific questions you guys might have, and I can elaborate a little bit more, is a good example of that would be something that I worked on this last week. So, how many of you have been following the National Grid lockout? Anyone? Okay, so the basic primer on that is in June of this year, National Grid and some of its union folks knew that they weren't necessarily going to agree on renewing their contracts. And the union said, look, we'll keep going under our current contracts, but we'd like to negotiate for some better things. And National Grid's response was basically, no. So they locked them out, no health care, no pay. About 1,200 workers are now not working. And this really came to mind because of the Merrimack Valley explosions, where there were those major gas explosions that just happened, and those were run by Columbia Gas, not National Grid. But on the city level, National Grid is pretty much the only thing we have. So it's one thing to be focused on safety implications, and the city council is going to be looking at safety implications around what our actual gas infrastructure looks like. But one thing that I did was actually follow up on a different story, which is about how it's influencing development. So you've got a bunch of developers that got these emails back in July and some phone calls in recent months saying, we don't have enough people, so we have to be focusing on emergency coverage. And that means that you guys won't have gas until 2019 if you're doing this existing project. And so I was talking to affordable housing developers and smaller developers about what this does to them, and the answer is it basically crushes them. So that's the kind of story that might not just float across the globe's desk, for instance, but it's something that you see if you're out there in the neighborhood every day, and if developers know you and if neighbors know you. So when you're kind of deeply embedded and when you're working on sourcing in general, it's just impossible to overstate how valuable it is to just be a physical presence in the area that you cover. And I found that I really do have a solid beat in the neighborhood of Dorchester, even if it's not a specific topic area.
Cool. All right, I'm going to ask the first question. Co-ops, internships at Dorchester
Yeah.
Reporter.
Oh gosh, so we usually have 1 or 2 interns per season. We're going to be working with Northeastern on getting the co-ops up and running because we are a small staff. So basically when you come an intern or co-op with us, you are a full reporter. We just don't have the capacity to give people busy work, which is a good thing and also a bad thing. So you'd be out at the same meetings that I'd be covering, and I'll make sure that everyone here has my contact info just in general.
Put it up here, actually.
Want to write it?
Yeah, do it.
This is going to be a handwriting test. This is not going to go well. I'm a journalist and the daughter of a scientist.
Anyone see it? We don't have a pen for us. So, oh, thank you very much.
There we go.
There you go.
All right.
What is it?
So the best way to reach me would be Jennifer. I have a really easy name.
Work. Probably go through 8 of these now before you get one that works.
Yeah, probably. Odds are. So it's going to be Jennifer dot Smith at .news.com.
.news.com.
Yeah. And any of you can feel free to email me if you've got questions about journalism in general or the reporter specifically. I have a deep and abiding love of coffee. I will get coffee with anyone for any reason, so just let me know.
Cool. All right, questions?
Yeah.
So I was super excited when I was reading about your partnership with the UR and when I was seeing some of the reporting that's going on with that. I'm wondering if there's any, and I guess it's also a question of capacity, but like for a community newspaper that has some stability and some like lasting impact, is there an interest in like using more digital tools for storytelling, like having an in-house audio person, an in-house video person?
Yeah. So what we have, which is interesting, is we actually have an embedded reporter with BUR that stays in our offices, and we also have a mobile rig in our offices. So it means that if I cover a meeting in the evening or if I cover something that's interesting and they want to have me or any of the other reporters on in the morning, we can just go into the offices and call in directly from there for more, I guess, bigger profile interviews. I'll sometimes bring a rig with me and record there. So yes, that partnership is kind of interesting because we can provide content and basically institutional knowledge to their reporter and help guide them with sourcing and stories, and they can use our stuff and we can use their stuff. So what they decide to do with it on their site is kind of up to them. So if they want to use a story and have an audio component, then we'll bring someone in to provide that. But that's very much a thing that we've been thinking about as far as making sure that we could be broadening the ways that people hear our stories, the way that people see our stories. We try and encourage our reporters, for instance, to, if they're at a rally or at an event, not just live tweet, also Periscope, also take pictures. And we have a small production team that, when appropriate, will work with graphics, especially because I go through a lot of city data. My pet project is student housing, which I have very strong feelings about, because the student housing numbers from the city every year almost always have problems with them. And so I have been covering those for 3 years, and there's always, you know, a basic preliminary heat map you can pull together to kind of see where people live and kind of give people a sense of where those are going. But, for instance, it would probably be really useful if there were capacity to have graphics that could evolve over time, see where students are moving throughout the city, especially because UMass Boston just opened its brand new dorms. So if you could kind of see those changes over time, I think that would really be a good component to the story itself. But it's not necessarily, again, something we have the capacity to do, but are always so excited when someone else comes in and says, look, do you want help on this? I have an idea about how to map transit in an interesting way, where the issue we run into is usually not one of enthusiasm, but one of there only being so many hours in the day and so many people physically in our office. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a few questions.
Sure.
What publications did you work at Northeastern?
So I wrote for the Huntington News when I was here in my first and second year, but then I immediately went over into co-op. So I shifted pretty quickly into just writing for broader news organizations, but I had friends that worked for, I don't know if they renamed it, what's the arts magazine now?
Artistry.
Yeah. So one of my friends wrote for them, and then a few of my other friends were more on the radio side of it. So I'm a print reporter in my bones. I have to do other things as well, but so that was true even at Northeastern. It was mostly the Huntington News that I was kind of stringing for.
What other co-ops did you do with the Boston Globe?
Yeah. So I started out, my first co-op was actually at the National Fire Protection Association in their PR department. And that sounds weird, but it's why I got the Globe Co-op, because they are a fire and life safety organization, which means that since I was on the PR side, I was writing up essentially informational briefs and informational articles. So if there was a terrible fire somewhere in South America in a warehouse, I had to cover that essentially, because journalists don't necessarily always know about it, and they'd reach out to our organization. So I basically had to do the journalism before the journalism. And that was really useful when I was going over to the Globe, because one of the first things they wanted to know when figuring out if I could do the mayhem shift was, how are you at covering disasters, and are you comfortable doing that? And that was a big thing that I learned there. I'm not sure if they still offer co-ops, but it was absolutely wonderful. They have internal magazines as well that are more on the magazine side of it, so you can do features, you can do things with fun graphics, and yeah, it was essentially a writing job that segued really well into more general journalism, because they were a nonprofit specifically focused around fire safety. So it wasn't like they were trying to push necessarily for a political advocacy effort. It was very much like, these are the things that we'd like to support, these are our programs that we have to, for instance, address forest fires, but it's rooted, for instance, in the fact that these fires are happening, and this is the context of it, and these are who are influenced. So when I went over to the Globe, and now in my current context as well, I already knew a lot of the fire chiefs that I had to deal with, so that was just a happy coincidence.
And what do you do to sort of establish your presence in the community, like make sure so people know that there are reporters and publications?
Yeah, a big thing of it is, I'm not sure exactly how it works in other parts of the city. Dorchester has this absolutely insanely huge civic network where there are neighborhood groups that meet monthly, and there's like 52 of them, and that's just the civic groups in Dorchester. Then you've got Main Street groups, then you've got city-run abutters meetings, then you've got locally run abutters meetings, you've got topic-specific meetings run through civic groups. So almost every single night for the first 2 years I was at the Reporter, I was just at meetings all the time. And it doesn't mean, I think it's important to note that being at the meetings doesn't mean that you're always covering them. Sometimes, yeah, there will be a brief or something, but the goal and the habit that we try to develop in the Reporter basically is if you go out to one of these meetings, just talk to people. You're probably going to come back with 1 or 2 stories, even if the meeting itself turned out to be sort of a non-issue. So that's a really big one, is just keeping an eye on where meetings are happening, reaching out to the local groups that are associated with them, and just say, hey, could I grab a coffee with the leader of this civic group? Could I attend this event or block party or something like that, and make sure to touch base with all of your members when I'm there? And then make sure everyone and their mother has your cell phone, and that's a big part of it too.
Can I ask a
Dan.
follow-up to that, Jennifer? Because I think that what you are talking about touches on a dilemma that a lot of editors have, and that is most small news organizations are very understaffed, and if you make the commitment that you're going to cover, the 3-hour neighborhood meeting, you've made a significant investment of time, and you've got to write it up at that point, regardless of whether it was particularly scintillating or not. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think the first thing to think about is, because there are so many meetings, and sometimes there will be 3 or 4 on one night in one neighborhood, and they mostly have agendas, and you mostly check in and say, hey, what are you guys going to be talking about today? So, for instance, if I'm deciding between, like, the McCormick Civic Group that's up on kind of the north end of Dorchester, or the Clam Point Group, which is kind of around the big colorful gas tank area, or the Lower Mills Civic Group, which is almost down at the line to Milton, for instance, and all 3 of those happen on the same night. So that's more of an issue of reaching out beforehand, making sure you know what they're going to discuss, because if one of them's going to be in a fight about a marijuana dispensary and the other one is like someone's trying to build a porch on their house, you're probably going to go to the marijuana dispensary one, or else you shouldn't be in journalism. That's a weird use of your time. Yeah.
Depends on the type.
Yeah, that's the other thing, and this is where it gets kind of weird and nerdy, is I discovered when I started there, which I didn't expect, is I have a deep, deep love of the things that really tick people off for inexplicable reasons. So there are some meetings where there will be almost just full-on shouting matches about whether or not someone can build a little head house on top of their roof to access a roof that no one can see from the street, but it will really bother neighbors to just know that it's there. That has literally taken half an hour of a meeting before, and it doesn't mean that you write up that entire thing. You're there for another reason, but I mean, you can't get out of community reporting without really understanding that the kinds of in and outs of neighborhood life that maybe bigger papers don't necessarily have the capacity or interest in covering, like, this stuff keeps them up at night. It's very easy to sort of think about it in a national way and think the same things that I'm reading every single day are the same things that most people in a neighborhood care about every single day. They will stay up at night talking about fences. Yeah.
Questions?
Questions, comments, concerns?
Another question. I'm curious about the financial side of running a community newspaper, and obviously you're on the
Yeah, I'm on the news side, yeah.
But do you feel like you're in a financially stable institution, and maybe like if so, like what maybe, I guess, talking about the state of community news?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, so the Reporter is kind of an interesting example. So, for instance, we're not the only community newspaper. You've got like the JP Gazette, you've got some more online publications in the South End and South Boston. You've got the Bay State Banner is a long-time legacy African American, also family-run organization, and all of us deal with staffing issues. We are pretty stable financially, I think, because because the type of news we do has been so consistent. It's not like we're suddenly announcing where we're segueing all the way over to digital and putting up a paywall. We tend to be, for instance, pretty strategic about what stories will pop up before we go out to print. So if there's like a good enterprise story, for instance, we don't necessarily want everyone to read that online first. We want to make sure that the readers who are actually getting the newspaper will see those things first. But it definitely limits what we can do as far as full-time staffing. So when I started, I was the only staff reporter. We always have correspondents and we have interns that'll get a variety of stipends or per article rates, basically. But when it comes to the core staff, the people that you can call out at 1 in the morning if you really need them to, that tends to be a pretty small crew. We have another staffer now actually that started as an intern, so my load's a little bit lighter than it used to be. But yeah, it's definitely a concern. Some of the smaller organizations that don't have quite the reputation we do maybe are working with 1 or 2 people in the entire newsroom, and they're doing production and layout and all of that themselves. We don't have that. We have a production team. We have managing editors. We have editor-in-chief. We have a separate side of it that deals with ads, sales, like the arrangement of the paper itself. So we're lucky. We're very small staff-wise, but we have enough people that we can kind of maintain a church and state relationship between ad and newsroom. Yeah.
You're singing my song.
Oh,
so
no.
I wanted to follow up on that. What you're really speaking to is, certain types of small community journalism has all been marginal, always been marginal. We've never gotten rich doing it.
That's true. That's not why you go into this field.
But today, we're constantly told that local journalism of this sort is in danger, and what people always point to are the fact that most community newspapers are owned by chains that are controlled either by publicly traded corporations or by hedge funds, and they are squeezing as much profit as they can out of them to satisfy their shareholders or their hedge fund owners. And it just strikes me, and you're kind of confirming it, that if you have a stable locally owned newspaper operating without debt, then things haven't really changed as much over the last 20 or 30 years as it sometimes appears.
Yeah, the changes tend to be more on as I understand it, to be more on the circulation side for the print. Where, since that's still our primary model, that's where a lot of our advertisement comes in, that's still an issue. So if circulation goes down, that's a problem. That's something that we have to, again, really make sure that that there's a compelling reason to go to us and not just somewhere else. And that, I think, ties in critically, basically, is that even though, for instance, we can use, through our BUR partnership, we can use some of their stories if they're covering Dorchester or if it's something that impacts us. And we also use the wire service associated with the State House News Service. If you guys are familiar with that, it's also great. If anyone is interested in political writing, that's a great place to try and intern as well. They're just rooted in the State House, phenomenal people in there. So we can use those kinds of things to bolster our coverage of the stories that we do think people need to know, but aren't necessarily the best use of our staffing time. So that's a really big one there, is just when you're a small organization, you need to be really smart about where you're devoting your handful of people. And you had something, yeah?
Yeah, I came in a little late.
Yeah, sure.
To talk about this, but, I'm third generation Boston.
Yeah.
Dorchester changes a lot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How do you as a newspaper adjust to changing audiences, and what does that look like in your reporting?
So, yeah, Dorchester is changing. Dorchester's growing taller. There are fights over that one. So,
And whiter and richer.
yeah, in certain areas. So the thing that's interesting about Dorchester, I say the word interesting a lot, it's fine, is there are pockets where it's a lot easier to see like what that change is. So for instance, I've lived in Dorchester for 2 years now. When I was here at Northeastern, I was in the Fenway area. I was over by the Whole Foods, so. But when I moved to Dorchester, I'm in Savin Hill. And Savin Hill has kind of always had this reputation in the old days as being like maybe not the best area of Dorchester, unless you were over the bridge where all the big, beautiful Victorian homes were. But when I moved to
Stab and kill. It used to
yeah,
be called,
just a whole situation.
I know, yeah.
I did a whole story on how to read murder stats and how to do crime stats in Dorchester, because an online publication that started did a really irresponsible read of that, and basically said that all of the crime happening in one single police district was all the crime in Dorchester, so I had to like go into that. But I was talking to the police chief in Mattapan, and he referenced that of course there's still this like old guard that calls Mattapan Murder Pan, which they do not like,
Yeah,
because
sure.
that's horrible. But so when I moved to Savin Hill, there were still a lot of vacant spots around there. And that was just 2 years ago. There was this place that everyone called the Savin Hill Hole that had just sat there empty for like 10 years. It was like an old Bulger era bar before then. And it was empty. And there was this vacant variety store that had just sat there for years and years and years. And in the last year and a half, there's now a new retail space and condos above that first Savin Hill Hole area, and there's a new like artisanal market being built at the site of the former variety store with condos next door to it. That's the last year. It's very difficult to kind of keep a handle on where those pockets of growth are happening. You can usually monitor it because they seem to be populated around transit. So I'm right by the Savin Hills T station, so you're seeing a lot of stuff go around there. Ashmont, all the way down at the end of the red line, you're seeing much bigger buildings going up. So we try and balance out covering the newsworthiness of these major proposals that are coming our way. For instance, there's a huge wharf project that got completely shut down in the DePonset area, which is waterfront basically. And so the developers thought the time was right for this big project, mixed use, residential, boutique hotel, there's a marina attached to it, and they thought it was a good time for it. They went to the Globe, they were very excited, and then over the course of a year of meetings, the neighbors completely decimated it. Even when it was just a residential proposal, they still said this is a no-go. The mayor weighs in, the local reps weigh in, and they kill it. So in a lot of ways, you still do see that Dorchester is kind of struggling with the renewed interest in it. And so you balance the fact that you have to cover these proposals. These are huge millions and millions of dollars in investment that people are trying to bring to the area, but they don't necessarily blend well with the communities who are sitting there saying, continue to live near this market that you want to give us. And so what we do in our reporting is just make sure that when there is pushback, we are taking that just as seriously as the people that are proposing the projects. And since we're not an advocacy paper, we're a newspaper, the most we can do and the best, most responsible thing we can do is to make sure that those objections and the responses are in print. They're part of the public record. So if people say, for instance, why are you trying to put a recreational marijuana business here? We didn't even want the store next door to get a full liquor license. That's part of the record in the same way. So since we are at these meetings, since we're covering all of these, it means that we in some ways have to both represent the voice of the people that already live there while understanding that I'm at the same citywide housing roundtables as all the other reporters. They're raising the goal for housing by 30% now. They're going to hit their 2030 housing goals in 2020. There needs to be more housing. So it's knowing that all of those conversations are being had, and that housing needs to go somewhere, but also noting the people that have lived in that same 3-decker for 50 years are also facing the prospect of being priced out of their own neighborhoods. So it's really just kind of trying to be respectful of the fact that their concerns arise out of a real instability, not just out of an opposition to new growth, even though that's there, and trying as best you can to assume that the people that live in a neighborhood are operating in good faith. And that can sometimes be tricky to do when you're just covering the biggest, flashiest housing projects and kind of the changes in rents over time, and balancing what might be, for instance, for me, personal frustration when a meeting around transit, bless you, when a meeting around transit gets interrupted by people protesting for affordable housing because the meeting was supposed to be on transit, but they do have a point. They are advocating for something. So I think that's the big thing, is just check your impulses on looking at it as kind of an objective macro level city reporter, and really try and understand why people are pushing back against it. And I think that's been a thing we've done pretty well over the years, but it's a thing that's now an additional conscious effort now. That's a big one, is just, yes, the neighborhood's changing. Yes, that makes people nervous. Why does it make them nervous? That's a big one. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I wanted to ask you if, in your opinion, do you think that community news organizations are more personalized compared to huger international news organizations in not alienating the people for reporting issues?
Sorry, could you rephrase that? Yeah.
I'm saying that, do you think that community newspapers are more personalized towards the community in reporting news as compared to the same topic maybe being covered by international news organizations?
Yeah, well, we have to be, is a big one. And it's not just, community organizations versus national or international publications. You see the difference in, the way, like the Times or Mother Jones will cover the same topic. You might have the same stats that are being pulled, the same basic information, even the way that, for instance, we, a community organization, and the Bay State Banner, another community organization, might cover the same issues, where I might be looking at it more from the specs side of things, and they're looking at it more from, this is a community of color trying to grapple with a specific concern in that community of color, which is still part of my story, but not the focus of it. So I think understanding, again, the market that you're trying to serve, yeah, community organizations need to be more personalized. We need to be a place where readers can recognize that their voices are being reflected without necessarily being a community newsletter, which is sometimes kind of a hard thing to explain to people locally, that yes, you might have said 20 things at a meeting, but our job is not to just repeat exactly what you said. It's to add context, it's to pick out what was more important or more germane to the conversation in general, and you guys can absolutely tweet, blog, do whatever you want, and if it's useful, we can embed those, we can link to those. But yeah, I think as a community organization, you need to be drawing from the places that you cover rather than parachuting in, even if the same broader topic area is being covered. Yeah.
Also, I want to add to that. I feel that your news organization, for a community news organization, has very good digital space.
Thank you.
Footprint. I would like to know your views on the future of it. Future of digital footprint for community media organization.
Yeah. So digital for a news organization of our size is really a pickle. So we have our print site, and it's not behind a paywall in some part because advertisers need to be able to see that they need to be able to look at the PDF of the paper, basically, and see, like, oh yes, the thing that we put in there is in fact on page 3. We can verify that. So at some level, we actually do need to have our content up online, and also it's so the comparison I draw is back kind of pre-Lewinsky era, when the question was, like, what do you put up behind a paywall? Where does news break? And is the internet just a way to get people to your physical paper or not? And obviously a lot of people misread that very, very badly and waited too long to put up paywalls. We still kind of walk that line, where we will put out some copy up online if it's breaking news, if it's something we have first, and we want to make sure that we have it documented, that we had it first, before our paper comes out on Wednesdays. So we'll do that, but it is, again, with the intent of making sure that there's still a value to the print product. I am interested in seeing what new digital publications pop up around community reporting, because we actually have a few that have come up in Dorchester in recent years, that have, again, tried to kind of serve this niche neighborhood interest focused on digital. The problem is the people running them aren't coming from a journalistic background. So you end up in situations like the crime stats story that I mentioned earlier, where they write a story that says Dorchester has the city's lowest crime rate, which is crazy. But it's a really good headline. It's a really fun thing on Twitter. So that thing gets, dozens and dozens of shares within the first few minutes of it going out, without the understanding from people who are just kind of looking at the entire news scope of Dorchester as there being like a difference in value between different organizations. Like if you've never looked at Dorchester like news of any kind before, and you drop in and you're just typing into Twitter like Dorchester, and 3 different organizations come up, you have no way of knowing which ones are institutional. You have no way of knowing what kind of fact-checking goes into any of them. So I'm glad that there's this desire to have more local coverage, especially using a digital medium, but I am very, very nervous personally about how that translates into the quality of journalistic work, whether there's the same incentive, for instance, to cite other news organizations is a really big one if you're talking about aggregation sites, basically, where it's like, if you guys are journalists and you spend a week working on something and you do good work and you find something that no one else has, you don't want to be in a situation where another organization that looks a lot like a newspaper has just taken that and put it online and you aren't in it. It's not your journalism. They're just stating it as though it's objective fact, where people just knew the churches were having discussions as though they intuited it from the air. So that's a really big thing. It's easier to navigate that on the print side, where if, for instance, the Globe or some other organization pulled a story that we'd done and didn't, give us credit first for it, we know the people to go to for that. We can say, hey, we noticed that you used this same information. We actually had it up a week earlier. It looks a lot like the story we've already done. It's just good protocol to give credit to the journalist that did it first, say, as first reported in. You can't really do that online, and the real question is whether or not that incentivizes local online publications to basically take advantage of the fact that not all news consumers are educated news consumers, and just put things out there that look a lot like little bloggy pieces of journalism. And I have no idea how you regulate that, but we're seeing a lot more of them now, and they will pull from local news organizations, they will pull from citywide organizations, they will pull from national organizations with the same amount of, does it even matter where we got this? So that's really hard to tread in the digital space. But yeah, there's an effort certainly to have like community first organizations that are online primarily.
So I'm a little confused. So
Yeah,
is
sorry.
there no paywall, or is it just you put a handful of stories up?
We don't have a paywall. Not all of our stuff ends up online,
Okay.
but that's not because we're saying, oh, you can't get this online. It's more like, for instance, if it's getting into kind of the brief territory.
Okay.
Like the Globe will put up, like, I used to have to write the news in briefs, like the little crime briefs,
Yep.
and those still go up online. But if, for instance, it's something like this person was appointed to this position and it was literally 3 graphs on page 7,
Yeah.
we won't necessarily have someone then take the time out to go put that online,
Okay.
unless it's a particularly newsworthy thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk numbers for a second, or are you able to about print and online?
I actually can't.
Okay.
It's actually one of the few areas of the paper that I'm isolated from because I'm news editor, so I really can't be thinking about kind of where traffic is coming from,
Yeah.
for the idea that that'll start to shape the things I'm more likely to be at. I mostly rely on being at the meetings, getting emails from people. Like, people will let me know what they're reading and what they're interested in, but, like, I do not wade in on circulation stuff at all.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry.
How much time we got here? We have one more question.
Yeah. Oh, wait, who was up?
Lynn.
Do you have such experience, like, when you're trying to get access to your source and they refuse the interview because you are not from big papers? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you are not.
Like you're a Northeastern student or something?
Yeah.
Oh, we don't really have.
Experience and how do you deal with that?
I had a lot more of those when I was a student journalist. So what I don't usually have is people refusing to talk to me because of the size of my publication. What we usually have is that we'll be chasing a story for a while and be working on it and developing sources and being pretty sure we've got all our information right, and then reaching out for comment, and they'll say, hey, we'll get back to you, and then they literally give it to another organization because they want a bigger platform. And it is not just us that deals with this, which is like kind of a sad thing about the organization, but like, for instance, the Boston Business Journal is a really excellent trade publication, and has really good, diligent journalists there, and they will be chasing stories and doing all of the good work and requesting comment, and then be told, okay, great, we'll get back to you tomorrow, and they open the computer the next day and it's like front page of the Globe. Not because the Globe doesn't have really good, dedicated journalists, but because for a lot of people, the first publication that pushes out your stuff matters. And you see the opposite of that sometimes too. For instance, with the Ayanna Pressley interview, she was very, very smart. She's like, look, it's a local publication. It's a young woman journalist that I know can talk at length about this race because I've been covering it the whole time. And then there's a feed into WBUR, but she didn't offer the interview to WBUR. She coordinated it with us to make sure that we could do that. So depending on what the source thinks they want out of the organization and the optics that come with that organization, they could either decide to just blow past you and give it to a major organization, or they could say, hey, frankly, it looks better if the people we're going to first are the ones with first-hand experience on it. So it can go either way, but brace yourself. It normally goes with them going with the larger organization first, not necessarily refusing to talk to you when you're in a professional, like, when you're no longer a student journalist, which still comes with a lot of stigma for a lot of people. They, like, same thing with interns. If someone answers the phone and says, hey, I'm writing this, and they just go, oh, are you an intern, as though that stops you from being able to perceive the answer to questions. And you have to say yes sometimes, and you have to say, yes, I'm a student journalist. And frankly, people aren't always that great about understanding that even if you're a student journalist, even if you're an intern, there's still a chain that's making sure that what you're producing is good and that the journalism is sound. So you will deal with that for a while, probably. And the only thing I can tell you is that in my experience, the way to overcome that is just consistent persistence. There are scoops that I've gotten that I've literally only gotten because I have been absolutely haranguing people for weeks, where I'll get in on the front floor of this huge, like in the front door on a huge thing that's happening that the Globe hasn't heard about, the Business Journal hasn't even heard about, and it's because I'm the person that, like, for 3 weeks has been like, hey, I hear you're about to file something with the city. are you gonna file something with the city? Because neighbors are gossiping about it. And as soon as they hear that, normally they'll, like, oh no, if gossip's already happening, we better get in there early. So that's a big one, is it might be frustrating, but sources notice persistence and news organizations reward persistence is a really, really big one. Just do good work, and it might sound a little cynical in this day and age, but like the work wins out a lot of the time.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.
Great,
That was awesome.
of course, thank you.